Morning all. Welcome first of all to Avril Links, who's joining us for the first time.
Thank you.
Avril is another Avril and another lawyer. So we are now blessed with how many have we got? We've got a triumvirate today. Some of our lawyers are missing, but we've got three, so that's not a bad proportion. It's interesting because the lawyers all like Sanhedrin. In fact, it was Leon's suggestion that we did Sanhedrin in the first place, wasn't it, Leon? Right, so welcome. I have to dedicate this shiur to a refuah shalema for Oria Chaim ben Chana Yehudit. Oria Chaim ben Chana Yehudit, who is a little baby who is very poorly in Great Ormond Street Hospital. I don't know any details except that he is in great need of our tefillot. So anything that we learn today should be in the merit for a refuah shalema for him. Okay, so we are in Sanhedrin, Daf Yud Aleph Amud Aleph, page 11a. And I will put on the screen, as soon as I can find it, there it is. I'll put the text on the screen. Those of you who are following in the Steinsaltz, it's page 54.
53?
Top of page 54 is where we're up to, I think.
Bottom of 53.
Yeah, bottom of 53.
Okay, so by the way, Avril Gatov, did you get your birthday present yet?
What birthday present?
You're going to get the Steinsaltz Gemarah for your birthday.
Yeah, no, I haven't got it yet.
How amazing is that Avril Gatov wants a Gemarah for her birthday?
Well, that's what I got.
Fantastic, wonderful. Okay, so you're right at the bottom of page 53 here, Daf Yud Amud Bet, right at the bottom. We had this very unsatisfactory explanation for a scenario. Let's just recap for Avril Links' benefit, just a very quick recap where we're holding. Let's work it out. Well, November will be 2 years. So how many is that? Last 21 months, we have spent looking at a single Mishnah in Sanhedrin. And the Mishnah is dealing with how many judges are required for the different types of cases that judges have to deal with. So capital cases need 23, monetary cases need 3, etc. And the question that we're dealing with at the moment is how many judges are required to declare Rosh Chodesh. As you may know, Rosh Chodesh, excuse me, Rosh Chodesh was declared by Bet Din on the sighting of the new moon. Of course, since many centuries, millennia even, there has been a fixed calendar, and we don't actually go by the sighting of the moon. But back at the time of the Mishnah, it needed witnesses to come, and a court had to examine those witnesses and declare that such a day was going to be Rosh Chodesh on the basis of the testimony given by these witnesses. The question that we're dealing with is how many judges are required for a court to hear the evidence of the Eidei Kiddushin, the Eidim, the witnesses for the new moon. And there is Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, who is, as we said last week, top of the Premier League of Tanaim. He gave the opinion that we start with 3, and if there is not a unanimous decision, we add in another 2, and so we've got 5. And then if there's still not a unanimous decision, we add in another 2, and there we have 7 and the decision is made by 7. And we struggled really to find satisfactory sources for this halakha of 3, 5, and 7. And the Gemara brought us 3 different psukim, which dealt with 3, 5, and 7. One was that at the time of the destruction of Jerusalem, at the time of the destruction of the first temple, the Tanakh in Malachim Bet, 2nd Kings, and also in Yirmiyahu, Jeremiah, has a description of the destruction of the temple. And in that description, it mentions that the 3 Shomrei Hasaf, guardians of the door, were taken away, and that's the origin of the 3. The Gemara then brought us another pasuk that said that there were 5 men who were ro'ei pnei hamelech, who saw the face of the king. In other words, they were the king's advisors. And then there was a different pasuk in Yirmiyahu which referred to 7 ro'ei pnei hamelech, 7 advisors. Rashi wasn't happy with that and brought Megillat Esther, where at the beginning of Megillat Esther, there is a description of the 7 advisors to Achashverosh who decided that Vashti, the queen, should be brought onto the parade to show off her beauty. And Rashi takes the 7 from there. And we were all agreed in this shiur, we were all agreed that actually they were very, very weak sources, and that the Gemara was really scrabbling around to find anything of any great substance to support Rabban Shimon Gamliel's view, which, by the way, is the halakha, that you start with 3, you move on to 5, and you end with 7. In the process of looking at these psukim, we noticed a very interesting discrepancy between the account of the destruction of the temple in Malachim Bet in Kings 2, chapter 25, verse 19, and the description of the same events in Sefer Yirmiyahu, Jeremiah chapter 52. And it was doubly problematic because Malachim Bet, 2nd Kings, is said to have been written by Yirmiyahu. And you've got 2 different versions of the same event, different versions of the number of advisors, and more importantly, different versions of the date that the destruction of the temple took place. In Malachim Bet, it talks about the 7th of Av, and in Yirmiyahu, it talks about the 10th of Av. And of course, we celebrate, it's not the right word, we commemorate the destruction of the temple on the 9th of Av. So we gave David Marks some homework to do, which, of course, being a goody two-shoes, he'd done within about half an hour and sent me his answers. And it was very interesting because, well, I'll let David explain to you. David, give us a summary of your findings of the difficult problem that we have in the stira, the contradictions between the accounts we find in Malachim Bet and Yirmiyahu.
Yeah, very, very simply, the author of the article that I sent you suggests, well, first of all, he points out that there are a number of discrepancies in the last chapter of Malachim Bet and the last chapter of Yirmiyahu, not just the discrepancy over the dates, not just discrepancy of the number of people that were Ro'ei Pnei HaMelech, and modern Bible scholars suggest that whilst the authorship of the two books may have been the same, they could have derived the material from a third-party source, and hence there were errors in transmitting the material from that third party.
Yeah, and I think that what I also picked up from that information that you sent me was that it was quite clear that they were real contradictions. Now, we're used to contradictions in the Gemarah, aren't we? And then what we do is we do all sorts of acrobatics and semantic acrobatics to try and square the circle, as it were. No, that's not the expression. Whatever it is, to try and bring the two opinions together so that we don't have a contradiction. And we say, no. What we mean in this case is X, and what we mean in this case is Y. And therefore, it's not really a contradiction because the two sources are talking about completely different things. We
Correct.
don't find...
And here, the traditional rabbinic interpretation that we found in Radak and in the Malbim was definitely a kvetch, that they were suggesting that there were originally 5 and maybe 2 were added on later, but those 2 didn't have the same status as the original 5. So that's, again, it's most unsatisfactory. I agree with you.
Yes. So what we see is an attempt by the traditional commentaries, Rashi, Radak, to do what we always try and do, which is to avoid having a conflict and find some kind of explanation for the contradiction. As David said, it's most unsatisfactory, and actually it's just quite straightforward. There are 2 different accounts. We're talking about events that took place 2,500 years ago. They weren't, these accounts, Malachim Bet and Yirmiyahu, were not written contemporaneously. They are talking about history. They didn't have firm, calendars that they could look up on Google. What day is it today? Or what time is it in Los Angeles right now? It's amazing that there's not more contradictions, really. And I know this is almost a bit sort of simple, really, but I'm very happy to accept that there are contradictions in Tanakh. We're not talking about the Chomshei Torah. We're not talking about the 5 books of Moses, which we believe was dictated to Moshe by Hashem, above our red line. If you remember our famous red line, beyond which we can't mess about with. This is Tanakh. It's below the red line. It was written, albeit according to some, with Ruach HaKodesh, with divine inspiration, but nevertheless, it was written by human beings. And I think that we need to be mature enough and accepting enough to say there are contradictions. We don't have satisfactory answers for them. Personally, I don't know what anybody else thinks, but I believe that no answer, i.e. we accept it as a contradiction, is better than a kvetched poor answer. Because if you have a poor answer, you just sort of shrug your shoulders and say, well, I'm not buying that. That's just, and it sort of devalues the opinions of the people that are giving it. And I don't like that. So when I see a sort of a real kvetch of an answer to a contradiction, it saddens me, because I believe it's more appropriate to say there's a contradiction. I can't explain that contradiction. We're human beings, and there you are. I think I probably once told you that I went to a shiur once, which took a whole hour to try and sort out a contradiction of the Rambam against the Rambam himself. He'd written X in one place and Y in another. And after a whole hour of acrobatics and showing how clever the person giving the shiur was, The bottom line was it was a printing mistake. It was a printing error. And I was livid because I felt that that was an hour of my time wasted. I'd gone to a shiur and I'd given up an hour of something else I could have done to go and try and learn something. And all I'd learned was just nonsense, really. It could have been said in 5 minutes. And I was very, very cross about it because that isn't the point of learning, as far as I'm concerned. Anyway, that's my rant over. Michael, did you have your hand up there?
Yeah, look, this is a technical question. Why bother with 5? You've got 3 and 5 and 7. If the 3 judges were also part of the 5, you're never going to get a majority on the 5 if you haven't got a majority on the 3. Because the guys who are, if it's 2-1 on the 3, one of those guys is going to vote against on the 5. So why bother with the 5 in the first place?
That's a good question. I think there is an answer. I've thought of an answer. Anyone want to give an answer before I give you my suggestion? Yes, David.
Yeah, again, this was something else that I sent you last week, if you remember. We're talking here, if you'll excuse me for correcting you, we're not talking about Rosh Chodesh, we're talking about Gemarah Chodesh, adding the extra month. This part of the mission is talking about adding the extra part of the month. And based on what was found at Qumran, it appears that there were various Jewish sects at the time of the Mishnah that were keeping the solar calendar rather than the solar lunar calendar. And the rabbis at the time wanted to create unity. They didn't want different sects. And because the calculations for intercalating the months were very, very complex, they felt that originally 3 judges were required. Then they brought in another 2 because of the complications, and then another 2 just to show the population at large that they were taking this very, very seriously and they wanted unity throughout the land.
Okay, thank you for that. And just to clarify, yes, when I said it was about Rosh Chodesh, I meant which day Rosh Chodesh was going to be, whether it was going to be the 29th, when it was going to be the 30th or the 31st day. So yes, it's the intercalating of the month that we're talking about. Yes, Julia, you have a suggestion.
Am I on or off?
You're on, we can hear you.
Oh, yeah, okay. No, my suggestion was if there is another 2 judges, this is to Michael's question, then perhaps they can be more persuasive than the originals, so that they might persuade the person who doesn't agree to accept the argument. Yeah,
that's exactly what I was going to say. Thank you, Julia. That's that's the idea, I think, of Michael, of bringing in another 2 judges. Is you bring in another 2, and presumably you would bring in 2 more senior judges. That's how I would do it anyway. And you would then all sit around and have your legal argument, and then hopefully you would be able to persuade the one who was the dissenter to agree, and then you'd have a majority. The interesting thing about the different sects that David just told us about is that at the time of the Mishnah, well, the time that the Mishnah is describing, remember the Mishnah was written down in 200, but at the time that the Mishnah is describing, which is at the time of the Second Temple, so around about the turn of the Sphira. So the Second Temple was in existence from 400 and something BCE until 70 CE. And during that period, which is the time which the Mishnah is referring to, it was a time of great splits in the Jewish people. There were loads of little sects which sprang up, and of course Christianity blossomed out of one of those sects. That's how it all started. The main 3 sects at the time were the Isim, the Essenes, the Saddukim, the Sadducees, and the Perushim, the Pharisees. The Essenes, the Isim, were ascetics who shunned society. They lived out in the wilds. They were very holy and pure. They were jumping in and out of the mikveh every 5 minutes to purify themselves. And the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were found in Qumran, which David referred to earlier on, are said to be from some kind of Isim, some kind of Essene community. The problem with the Isim, the Essenes, was one of their things was to practice celibacy. Well, as you'll probably work out, if you practice celibacy, you ain't got a great future. And not surprisingly, the Isim, the Essenes, fizzled out fairly quickly. It doesn't take a genius to work out why. The other main two sects were the Saddukim, the Sadducees, and the Perushim, the Pharisees. Well, the Saddukim, the Sadducees, their power base was amongst the intellectuals and was amongst the Kohanim. Their headquarters, if you like, their central office was the Bet HaMikdash. The name Saddukim comes from the name Tzadok. Tzadok was the Kohen Gadol. It was a popular name for Kohanim. So their power base was the Kahuna, the priesthood, and the temple. Well, of course, once the temple was destroyed in 70 CE, their power base had gone. And they very quickly diminished in power to leave the Pharisees, the Perushim, as the only real major sect of Judaism. And they metamorphosed into what we now know as Rabbinic Judaism. We are all, if you like, descendants of the Pharisees. The Pharisees turned itself into Rabbinic Judaism. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, of course, famously said, "Give me Yavne and its Chachamim." And the rabbis went up to Yavne, then they went into up into the north, and they maintained Judaism through what then became as a rabbinic ordination, and that were the Pharisees. So the Pharisees, which were only one of the major sects at the time, became the dominant sect. There were a few little other outliers like the Karaites and the Samaritans, and but they never really caught on. It was a bit like Betamax and VHS, really. You know, there was nothing wrong with Betamax really, but VHS had the muzzle, and that took off. And it was the same with the Pharisees, really. They were the ones that took off, and that became traditional Judaism. How did we get into that? I have no idea. I can't remember. Yeah, so we've got various different contradictions here. And I think the point that I want to make really is that we need to learn to live with the contradictions. We need to be the Queen of Hearts. Who's read Alice in Wonderland? Yeah, Alice Through the Looking Glass, if we're really calling it its proper name. Yeah, we've all read it. Well, my favorite character was the Queen of Hearts. You must have read it, Jeffrey, Alice Through the Looking Glass. No? Oh, gosh. Don't let your brother know that you haven't read it. He'll be ashamed of you. So, you know, you've got to read Alice Through the Looking Glass. My favorite character in Alice Through the Looking Glass was the Queen of Hearts, who famously said that she had at least 5 contradictions before breakfast every day. And that's how Lewis Carroll saw life, as one great big contradiction. And we need and it's something which we have not been very good at in Judaism, and that is accepting contradictions. We all try to play happy families and make the contradictions go away, and that's fine. But sometimes we have to accept that there are contradictions, and we have to live with them. And that's the point that I just wanted to bring out from here. Let's go now into the Gemarah. And let's get the Gemarah back on the screen. And let's carry on and do a little bit more of the Gemarah. So that's really the follow-up from last week that we've just done there. Thank you to David for doing his homework so diligently and for sending me interesting stuff, which we've talked about. So here we are. So, Tani Rav Yosef. This is a follow-on from what we've just said about the 3, 5, and 7. It's really saying the same thing, as we'll see. Tani Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef taught a Braita. Hane Shlosha v'chamisha v'shiva. This idea of 3, 5, and 7 judges. Sorry, let me just switch that phone off. Thank you. Keneged Shomrei Asaf. The 3 is the three guardians of the door that we spoke about from Malachim. Chamisha, the 5, is the 5 people who see the face of the Melech, in other words, the advisors to the king, and the 7 is the 7 advisors to the king. So you're going to ask me, well, why is he saying no? Just said it. It's exactly what we've just said up here. So why is Rav Yosef saying the same thing? It's a support. When the Gemarah says something, and it's a little bit of a psychological issue, this, because when the Gemarah says something which you might think, that's a bit schwach, they'll often bring another support for it, because it's almost like it's reading your mind, as if to say, well, you might think this is a bit, on the schwach side, but I can bring you another support for it. And this is Rav Yosef saying the same thing, but in a different place, and thereby bolstering the opinion. And then we have a bit of a funny exchange here between Abaye and Rav Yosef. Amalei Abaye la Rav Yosef. Abaye said to Rav Yosef, who's just given us this explanation, Ad ha'idna mai tama la parish lon mar hachi. He says to him, why didn't you tell us this before? Ad ha'idna. Ha'idna means nowadays, until nowadays. In other words, up till now, my tama, what is the reason? Lo paresh lan mar. Why has the master, mar is the master, why has the master not explained hochi this here? In other words,
aren't the Breitas before the Gemarah, Johnny, weren't they?
The Braita is, yes, the Braita is before the Gemarah.
So
the
that's
Braita
why
is the Braita is discussions of the Tanaim of the Mishnah, which never made it to the final version. They ended up on the cutting floor.
So did he say it first then?
Oh yeah,
So, yeah.
he did. He may well have done. He may well have done. This is a discussion between Tanaim here, and he's saying, well, Rav Yosef says this, and Abaye says to him, well, why have you only just said that now? And he gives a very funny answer to a peculiar question, really. Amalahu, and so he answers back. Rav Yosef answers back, and he says to them, Lo hava yadana. You can see that word in there, yadana. What word can you see in there? Yodea. Yodea. No. Lo hava yadana. I did not know. Ditzrichitu. What word can you see in there?
Sarich, necessary.
Sarich, necessary. Correct. Lo hava yadana ditzrichu. I didn't know you needed to know. I didn't tell you because I didn't think you needed to know. Mi beitu minai milta velo amri lechu. Have you ever asked me anything and I never told you the answer? In other words, if you'd have asked me, I'd have told you. It's a very peculiar little exchange, this, and I'm not really sure what we make of it. and I don't really know why it's in the Gemara. Anybody got any suggestions as to why this rather peculiar exchange? Rav Yosef says something, Abaye says, well, that's a bit strange. Why are you only just piping up now? And Abaye says, well, if you'd have asked me, I'd have told you. Rav Yosef says, if you'd have asked me, I'd have told you. You never asked me. I don't really know what we're meant to make of that. Rav Steinsaltz doesn't give us any clues either as to what's going on there. Does the art scroll say anything, Leon, as to this?
No.
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 So it's a bit peculiar, really. Anybody got any suggestions that you might want to throw in there? No, I couldn't really think of anything, but there you go. That's the Gemarah for you. It often goes off at funny old tangents, and it will tell you something, and there you go. Now we come back to having had that little aside. There is our old friend, the mnemonic. We're familiar with this from the Gemarah before. Remember that the Gemarah was written in around about 500 CE, way before the printing press. Handwritten manuscripts will have been very rare and incredibly expensive, and not necessarily entirely accurate either, because of course when you're copying things out by hand, mistakes creep in. So most of this stuff was learned by heart, and even to this day, when we are 600 years after the invention of the printing press, when you can buy a set of Mishnayot for a very small price, there is a great deal of emphasis certainly in the Haredi world, on learning stuff off by heart. Now, there's two reasons for that. One, I think, is a very valid reason, and another, I think, is less valid. The valid reason is that there is no doubt that when you learn something off by heart and it's stuck in your head and you've remembered it, then you know that material far better than if you are just reading it. I will not try this out, but I bet that all of you could recite the Shema or the Manishtana, and some of you might even be able to recite the entirety of the Shemona Esra off by heart, because that's how you did it. You learnt it when you were a very small child, and you will never forget those things. Never. They are ingrained and imprinted on your brain. So the concept of learning stuff off by heart, I think, has a valid reason. The other reason that the Haredi world is so emphasizes learning stuff off by heart is really to preserve the tradition, because that is how, when back in the day, and I'm not talking prior to the printing press, I'm talking sort of, I suppose, prior to the turn of the 20th century, the way you demonstrated your scholarliness, your scholarship, to all around you, was to be able to quote Mishnayos and Gemorahs off by heart. I'm sure you've all been to droshas where the guy giving the drosha has said, and it says in Gemarah Kiddushin, Daf Mem Gimel Amud Beis X, Y, Z, and you're thinking, whoa, that's impressive that you know that off by heart. The truth is, he just looked it up before he started. But you know, if it were to be the case that there are people with incredible memories who can memorize the entirety of Shas, the entirety of the Gemarah. And every year in Pirchei Agudah, which is the youngsters Haredi youth group, there's a Mishnayos competition for who can remember, who can recite the most Mishnayos off by heart. And you used to have every year, you'd have these kids, literally, I'm not exaggerating, You'd have these kids of 7 and 8 years old who could recite to you 200, 300 Mishnayos off by heart. Whether they understood them or not is another question. And you could argue that, you know, it's not quality, it's not quantity, it's quality, and it's a different argument. But the point is that memorizing stuff off by heart is a very important part of our tradition. It's a masorah. It's something which is still very much thought of held in high regard, particularly in the Haredi world. So
Sephardi as well, Johnny. The Sephardi boys of 7 and 8 can do the whole davening off by heart.
Correct, and they know it.
And they know it.
And they know it. If you go to a hotel and you've got Sephardi people there running the tefillot, which they almost always do, they all know the tefillot off by heart. Kids know it off by heart. I remember the first time I went to Gibraltar, and I went to the Sharei Tefillah, as it so happens, which is obviously the name of our shul. The main shul one of the main shuls in Gibraltar is called Sharei Tefillah. Most beautiful, beautiful shul. If you've never been, definitely worth a visit. And I was awestruck there because there were kids there of 4 or 5 years old who recited the entirety of Shabbos morning davening, every single word off by heart. It was unbelievable. It was beautiful. It was amazing and incredibly impressive. And I remember thinking that you know, that must be how it must have been done for hundreds and hundreds of years. And it was a really beautiful experience. But to bring it back to our Gemara, why am I telling you all this? Is that occasionally the Gemara helps us out because we're meant to remember all this Gemara off by heart. So like when we were all doing our exams in school, if you had to remember stuff, you used to make yourself little mnemonics. Our favorite one, of course, was the spectrum of the rainbow. Yeah, red, orange, yellow, indigo, blue, whatever it is. Remember, Richard of York gave battle in vain. Yeah, we all know that one. Or the one that I was taught in school for that was, remember, O ye Germans, Britain is victorious. That was what we were taught as a mnemonic. There were also some various mnemonics we learned in medical school, but I can't repeat them because they were all very rude. But of course, you remember them. The ruder they are, the more you remember them. Mnemonics are there to help you remember stuff. And that's what the Gemara is doing now. And it's giving us a mnemonic to remember these next few brightot. Remember, a brighter was never written down. A brighter were discussions between the Tanaim, which never made it into the Mishnah, and they were never written down. So they were passed on orally. So they had to be remembered. And the mnemonic we've got here is Zman Nasi Tzarich Gedi, which is 4 seemingly random words. But what does it mean? A mnemonic has to mean something. So, you know, remember, oh, you Germans, Britain is victorious is a sentence that makes sense. Or Richard of York gave battle in vain is a sentence that you can remember because it makes sense. So what does this mean? Zman Nasi, the time of a prince. Tzarich Gedi, needs a kid. I don't know what that means, but it's a sentence that has some kind of meaning. And so you remember Zman Nasi Tzarich Gedi, and you remember that mnemonic, you're then able to remember the coming brightot that we're going to learn now. And the first one is Zman. That's the first one of these 4 brightot that we're going to learn. So what does the Zman refer to? What's that mnemonic Zman sending us to? It's sending us to this brighter, very interesting brighter, a halacha. Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, and this is in a brighter. This is a discussion of the rabbis sat around, probably in Tiberia or up there in the Galil, having a chat about what the halacha is, and they made a statement: Ein ma'avrin et hashana ela b'mezumanin la. So here's our famous expression, Ein ela. Can you see that in that sentence? There's 2 words, Ein ela, We learnt this almost in the very first week of our Gemarah Shir. Ein ela means only. So it is not except. So ein ma'abrin et ashana. You do not expand the year, intercalate the year. Here we're talking about the intercalation of a year, which is the addition of the extra month in a leap year. So the month of Adar Rishon, normally there's only one Adar, but in a leap year, there are two Adars. And as we discussed a few weeks ago, the extra Adar, almost counterintuitively, is not the second Adar, but the first Adar. The first Adar is a month which is intercalated. It's added in so that the lunar calendar stays more or less in sync with the solar calendar. And the reason we have to do that, as we discussed, is because Pesach has to be in the spring. Pesach is called Chag HaAviv, the festival of the spring. Pesach has to be in the spring. And if you don't put a month in 7 times in 19 years, you'll end up with Pesach moving throughout the year, because the lunar year is 11 days shorter than the solar year. So each year, without the intercalation of a month, Pesach would get 11 days earlier each year. And within 3 years, instead of it being in April, it will be in March. After another 3 years, it will be in February. After another 3 years, it will be in January. And by the time you've got like 20 years on, you've got Pesach in September, and it all falls apart. So you have to have this extra month, and it's all been calculated for us now. We know exactly when it is. But at the time of the Mishnah, the rabbis had to make a decision as to whether this coming year is going to be a leap year, whether we're going to have an extra year or not, an extra month in the year or not. And this Braita is telling us that that decision was only made b'mezumanin la. Now, mezumanin, that's a word that you will be familiar with from various different contexts in modern Hebrew. Where do you see that word in modern Hebrew? Avril, I saw you mouthing something, so unmute yourself and tell us where you see it. Avril Links. You just look at
yeah, I just thought about benching, that's all. The
yes, correct. Benching is correct. A mezuman. What is a mezuman when we bench after we've eaten? Three people. And what so you got 3 people. And what do we do when we have that mezuman? Go on, Avril Gatov, unmute.
We invite them to bench.
Correct, we invite them. We say, Rabotai Nevarech, which means, gentlemen, let's bless, let's bench. In other words, it's an invitation. If you send an invitation to a wedding, that is called a hazmana, an invitation. Lahazmin is to invite. There's also another word, mezuman. What's mezumanim in modern Hebrew? As well as being somebody who's invited, there is another word which is mezumanim. Money. Anyone know? I'll give you a clue.
Doesn't the husband mean to book as well?
Yes, it means to book. Well, yes, they say it's right. You book a restaurant, you book a table, and it's the same idea. You're inviting yourself in that regard. But yes, lahazmin is to book, to invite, to order as well. To order. If you're in a restaurant, you want to be. You say to them, "Efshar lahazmin." Is it possible to order? Same idea. But mezumanim. What's mezumanim? I'll give you a clue. It's the opposite of ashrai. When you go to a shop and they say to you, Muzuman or Ashrai, what are they asking you?
Cash.
Yes, cash or credit card. Ashrai is a credit card. Kartis Ashrai is a credit card. But Mezumanim is cash. And Jeffrey Glasky, what do we call cash? That's it. Unmute and tell us, Jeffrey, what do we call cash?
Reddies.
Reddies. That's right.
Reddies.
Cash is reddies, right? Because Musulmanim is ready. You are ready. You've been invited. This stuff here in your hand is ready to use. That's why cash is called reddies. It's ready to use. You don't have to write a check. You don't have to use a credit card. Muzumanim. So in modern Hebrew, Muzumanim is cash. Muzuman is cash. So here, our context here is the context that Avril Links said, which is to invite. The Breita is telling us that the rabbis, the rabbis can only make the decision as to whether to intercalate the extra month of the year with ready invited dayanim. So you have to be appointed. Musulman can also be appointed. It's the same idea as invited. You have to be invited or appointed by the Nasi, by the prince. The Nasi was the president of the assembly, and so now you can go back to our mnemonic and you can see how it helps us. Zman Nasi Sarich Gedi. Zman is the same word as Musulman, and he's invited by the Nasi, by the president. So the president of the Sanhedrin, the Rosh Sanhedrin, the Rosh Bet Din, the Av Bet Din, as we would call it today, has to appoint or invite the Dayanim who are going to make this decision. So they then have, so that means if you're not invited, then you can't be part of the decision-making process. The Gemara is now going to tell us a little story. Ma'aseh, which is the Hebrew word, which is Yiddishifized, and we all know the word Meister, like a Bubba Meister. Okay, what's a Bubba Meister? A Bubba Meister is an old wives' tale. A Bubba is a grandmother, an old wife, right? And a Meister is a tale. It comes from this word here, Ma'aseh. It happened. There was an incident, from the word oseh, to do. So ma'aseh means this happened. There was a happening, a story. So ma'aseh b'Rabban Gamliel, there was a story with Rabban Gamliel. Rabban Gamliel was, in fact, the Nasi. He was the president of the great Sanhedrin. And this happened, and he said, Hashkimu li shiva la'aliyah. He said, bring me 7 dayanim, 7 chachamim, tomorrow morning, hashkimu, from the word lahashkim. Where do we have that word lahashkim? Avril, I think you mouthed it.
From hashkoma.
Hashkoma, okay, the hashkoma. What is the hashkoma, minion?
The early one.
The early one, that's right. So lahashkim means to get up early. Where do we see it in the Torah? We see it a number of times in the Torah. We can see we've lost David, who's our Tanakh, our Torah expert, so you'll have to make do with me. I can think of 2 places where we see it very clearly. Who got up early and we use that word?
Abraham, when he was going to give up Isaac as an offering.
Correct. And the Akedah Yitzchak, Abraham, it says, Vayashkem Abraham Baboke. He got up early and he saddled his ass. He got up early. And who else got up early?
Was it Balak?
Yes, no, not Balak. You're right. Bilam. On his way to Balak. Correct, Avril. Also says, Vayashkem Baboke. He got up early. So he says here, Rabban Gamliel says, Hashkimu li shiva. Bring me 7, means 7 of the chachamim, early in the morning. La aliyah. Aliyah, what's aliyah? To go up. To go up. So where does he want them to go? Where do you, if you're in a house, where do you go up to? You go up to the roof, to the loft, or the top floor. Now, it seems that this is where the this little cabal of Dayanim had their discussions about adding in another month, about intercalating a month in the top floor, the aliyah, the loft of the courthouse. And so he says, bring me tomorrow morning up to the loft 7 chachamim. Hishkim, he got up early in the morning and he walks into the loft, to the courtroom where it is. Umatzah, and he finds Shmona. There's 8 of them there, but he's only invited 7. That's a problem, because we have a halacha that says you can't intercalate a month with people who've not been invited. And Rabban Gamliel said, get me 7. And presumably he specified, or somebody decided which 7 it was going to be, because listen to the story. Amar, he said, Mi hu sha'ala shelo birshut, whichever one of you, Allah, we say Allah la'aretz, ani aliti la'aretz, I made aliyah to Israel, lifnei shmona shana, 8 years ago or wherever. Mi hu sha'ala, the one who ascended, in other words, came up to the roof, to the rooftop, to the loft, shelo birshut, without permission. Reshut is permission. Yered, he must go down, he must leave. Because why? Why? Okay, why? So let him stay there. So what? So there's 8 instead of 7. Big deal. So what? Why has he got to go down? This one that's not been invited. This is a proof for this halacha in the Brighton. Because if it was just a matter of, okay, so it doesn't matter that we need 7, but we've got 8, all right? Doesn't matter, we've got 8. No, you've got to be invited. Otherwise, it's invalid. The whole process is invalid. It's a legal process. You can't do something which is against legal process. So Rabban Gamliel has to tell the guy, he doesn't know which one it is because he doesn't know who it is. He has to say, sorry, mate, but you've got to go down, whoever you are, because you're mucking up the legal process. We can't do what we're meant to be doing, which is to intercalate the year or not intercalate the year if you're here. So what happens is, Ahmad Shmuel Hakatan. Shmuel Hakatan. What does that mean? Shmuel Hakatan. Shmuel the little one. Yeah. Katan is small. So Shmuel Hakatan, the little Shmuel, Ahmad, stood up, from the same word as Amidah, which we do the standing prayer. He stood up, Va'amar, and he said, Ani hu she'aliti shelo birshut. It was me who came up here without permission. I'm sorry, it was me. But v'lo la'aber hashana aliti, I didn't come up to take part in the process of intercalation of the year. Ella, rather, lilmod halacha lema'aseh utzrachti. I just came to observe and to watch the halacha in process, because I need to learn. I'm only I'm a student. One day I might be a dayan. I want to learn. I'm just observing. I didn't come up here to muck up your process. I didn't come here to pretend to be part of the decision-making process. I just came in to watch proceedings. I'm just supernumerary. I'm just here to observe and learn. Amar lo. So Rabban Gamliel said to him, Shev b'ni. Sit, my son. Shev, sit. In other words, you can stay. You don't have to go. Re'uyot kol hashanim kulan lehitaber al yadcha. All the years are fitting to be intercalated by you. In other words, you are such a great person that it's fitting that you should be part of this process, and you can stay not just as an observer, but you can stay as the as part of the process. Whoa, hang on a minute. If Rabban Gamliel is saying you can stay as part of the process, what's going on? He wasn't originally invited for that process. So what's going on? Ela Amru Chachamim, the Chachamim said, hey, hang on a minute. Ein ma'abrim et hashana ela bimzumanin la. You can't intercalate a year except with people who've been invited for the job. Velo Shmuel. So this is the answer. And the answer was, you should know, Velo Shmuel Hakatan Hava. It was not Shmuel Hakatan who was not invited. He really was invited. Ela inish acharina. You can see the word acher in there. It was another man. It wasn't him, the Gemara says. Umachamat kisufa hu da'avad. And who, he, Shmuel HaKatan, did what he did in order to preserve the dignity and to prevent the embarrassment of the one who actually was not invited. So Shmuel HaKatan was willing to own up to a misdemeanor, if you like, that he had not done in order to spare the blushes of the person who had actually done it. Okay, so now we've still got a problem.
Johnny.
Yes.
Johnny, what about the integrity of the one that was invited, having not stood up and said anything?
The one that wasn't invited?
Yes.
Yeah, he didn't do it, did he? He didn't stand up and say it was me. So he's sat there, not owning up. Doesn't reflect very well on him, does it?
No.
So that's that was the story, and it's telling us that story to teach us two things, and we'll stop here. And then next time we're going to do another story about Shmuel HaKatan. It's telling us two things. One, that there is this halacha that you have to be invited to do this Ibur Hashana, this intercalating. It's also telling you that it required 7 judges, because Rabban Gamliel says, this is something we learn as a sort of almost aside. He says, Hashkimu li shiva, bring me 7 judges. Well, why would he want 7 judges unless you needed 7 judges? So he's teaching us that halacha as well from this Braita. We need 7 judges for Ibur Hashana, and you have to be invited. And by the way, the story teaches us of the humility and the greatness of Shmuel HaKatan, the little Shmuel. And if you have a look, we'll just finish with this. Have a look on the side of the screen here. If you're in your Steinsaltz, it's at the bottom of page 54 on the left-hand side. Tells us who Shmuel HaKatan was. He was one of the early Tanaim. He lived during the period of the Second Temple. According to several sources, he was one of the youngest students of Hillel, and he lived a long life and died a short time before the temple's destruction. Only a small number of statements of his were transmitted, primarily in the realm of Agadah, that's stories. Now, this is what's very interesting. This is what I wanted to point out to you. We have a legacy of Shmuel HaKatan. We say 3 times a day a prayer called the Amidah, the standing prayer, which is also known as what? Jeffrey?
Shmona Esrei,
Which means,
18.
and why is it called the 18?
Because there were, well, there was at one time 18 brachas.
Correct. Well, nicely put, Jeffrey. There was at one time 18 brachot. And then what happened?
Well, they got an extra one because they had to overschlag.
Okay, so they put in an extra one, and they put in an extra one. Which extra one was put in?
Slanderers.
Yes, ve'lam al shinim al tehi tikva. To those slanderers, let there be no hope. Tikva is in there, that word hatikva. It was an extra bracha that was added against heretics. And that is in our Shmona Esra. So the Shmona Esra is in fact not a Shmona Esra at all. And we really shouldn't even refer to it as a Shmona Esra if we're accurate. We should call it the Amidah because it's a standing prayer. If we were going to be accurate, we should call it the Cha Esrei, the 19, as opposed to the Shmona Esrei, the 18. But the Shmona Esrei is stuck, and that's what it gets called. Now, what's this got to do with the price of cheese? It seems that Shmuel HaKatan was the one who wrote that extra bracha, Ve'lam al shinim, and he was the one that inserted it into the Amidah. Over here, it says here, in addition, the Gemarah reports that Shmuel HaKatan was uniquely suited to compose the blessing of the heretics, which is essentially a curse against the heretics and slanderers, recited until this day as part of the Amidah prayer. Evidently, he was chosen to compose this blessing due to his personal piety and humility, as we have just demonstrated. So here we have a piece of living Torah. The Gemarah, written 1500 years ago, is telling us a story which we can see has a legacy and is reflected in our daily practice, that we have the extra bracha written by Shmuel HaKatan, and he was considered fitting for that because of his great humility, which we've just described, and which we will describe in another story in next week's thrilling episode. Any questions, comments? Yes, Avril, you'll have to unmute or else we won't be able to hear you.
Yeah, can I ask you a question? You gave him permission after he was already there. So it occurred to me there was an issue about the timing of the permission, whether you could, and being invited, he invited him when he was already there. So before he received the invitation, it was an invalid meeting, but presumably it was validated at that point. So any decision afterwards would have been legal within that framework. Because I don't mind, we didn't decide whether it had to be 8. I mean, if that invalidated it or not. But with the 7, the permission thing was sort of, that box was ticked once he was given permission.
I think that's absolutely right. That occurred to me too. That's a very good point. So once he's given permission, he's then invited, isn't he? So he is mazumanin. But you've alluded to I think the answer, and that is that that then leaves 8 dayanim. What's the problem with 8 dayanim, folks?
It's an even number.
It's an even number. We have a concept, which of course, Avril, you weren't party to because you've only just joined, but all of this Chevra know that we have a concept, ein shakul bebet din, that we can't have an equal number in a bet din. You can't have an even number because you've got to have a majority. So you couldn't have 8. The halacha is you've got to have 7. That's the halacha. That's what we're trying to prove. So 8 is no good on 2 counts. 1, it's an even number, and 2, it isn't 7. So you could say, okay, well, to spare everybody's blushes, we'll go and get another one, and we'll make 9. Well, you can't, because the halacha is that you've got to have 7. That's the whole thing that we're proving. This whole Gemara is about how many judges you need for this job. So whilst I think you're right to point out that Rab Shmuel HaKatan became a Mazuman, even if he wasn't, even though we know he was, because he was only saying that to spare the other guy's blushes. But let's assume that he wasn't. He then becomes Mazuman, but then we've got 8, and so we've still got to get rid of one of them. So that's why it would be invalid. Yes, Morris.
Johnny, is a judge obliged to vote, or can he abstain if he's not sure?
The judge is obliged to vote. You can't sit on the fence as a judge. That's why, because if you were allowed to abstain, then it won't make any difference whether it was even or odd, would it? Because if you had 7 and 1 abstained, you could still have a 3-3 tie. So no, in Jewish courts, they have to give an opinion. Jeffrey.
I seem to recall as a child that the Spanish and Portuguese congregation called the Amidah, and did not refer to it as Shemona Esrei. And they were very, very precise on things like pronunciation. They were very critical of the Ashkenazi way of davening, where all the words are slurred. You cannot make out the words unless you are a Torah scholar that knows the words off by heart. And they were very, very critical of the way the Ashkenazim, or the so-called frummers in their mind, conducted themselves in the Bet Knesset.
You're quite right, Jeffrey. And it's not just the Spanish and Portuguese, although I understand you're saying that because that was your experience. Is the Sephardim in general are very much more, and this is what we were saying before when I was talking about in Gibraltar, which of course are Spanish and Portuguese largely. The Sephardim in general are much more careful about the pronunciation, about the way they pronounce each letter. They pronounce the shva, na, and nach in the correct way. If there's a dot in the word, they will pronounce that as well. Generally speaking, Ashkenazim are very scruffy in the way they pronounce their Hebrew. I often, and in the Hasidim particularly, they slur the words into another. I once went to a wedding, a Hasidic wedding, where we davened mincha beforehand, and the guy that davened before the Amud, I said to somebody next to me, I said, do you know what? I said, it's a good job that God knows the words, because there's no way that he could have made out what they were. It was impossible. You didn't even know what language he was speaking. It was just a really, if I'm honest, it was a bastardization of the whole process. But you're quite right, Jeffrey. The Sephardim are very, very careful. If you listen carefully to the laning on Shabbat, or tomorrow morning, in fact, Ruby Stepansky, who's just joined our Kehillah, who is going to be laning part of the Sedra on Shabbat, he is very, very, he's Ashkenazi as it so happens, but he is very, very careful about the pronunciation of every single letter correctly, and every little, what we call mapik hey, the hey with a dot in it, you're meant to pronounce. So there is a difference, for example, between the word Isha, which means what? Isha is a woman, and Isha, and you pronounce the hey at the end. So it's spelled exactly the same, but you pronounce the hey at the end. And what does that mean? It means her husband. So Isha is a woman. Isha is her husband, and it makes a completely difference. Makes a huge difference to what the meaning of the word. So you're meant to say it properly. Now you'll see he says it almost obsessively correctly, and it's the correct way to do it. Sephardim, generally speaking, do that. Ashkenazim don't, and you're absolutely quite right about that. I don't know how we got into that, but you're right about it.
He's also, just referring back to him, he's so fluent. I mean, he really does it very quickly, and you can follow.
Yes, it's very, very correct and very proper.
Very correct.
Yeah. Good. Any other comments? Right. In that case, we'll okay. Okay, you can stop recording now, Avril, if you would, please. and